If you're looking for another roguelite to sink countless hours into, Tyrant Realm is a relatively new title that mixes Soulslike combat with roguelite progression as you move through procedurally generated zones to face off with the Tyrant himself. This is all presented with a visual style inspired by the PlayStation 1 era of games to invoke a bit of nostalgia of simpler times. My name's Johnny Bueno, and let's take a look at Tyrant Realm. Tyrant Realm's setting takes place in a dark fantasy world filled with a number of gritty yet surprisingly unique zones. And yes, I'm aware that I'm reviewing yet another dark fantasy game with retro graphics and roguelite elements. I won't deny that I clearly have a type. Like any Souls-like style game, you'll start out shirtless and in prison. No character creation necessary, just hit play and you're immediately in the slammer. Once you've progressed through the slammer, you'll be able to visit Tyrant Realm's other, realms, which I found to be fairly diverse. Not only visually, but also in how you interact with them as well. The northern caverns feature a snowy environment with some greater verticality with its many pits, ramps, and wooden structures. The hunting ground is much more confined as it essentially is a hedge maze filled with tight corners and traps. The Forbidden Tomb has breakable walls filled with hidden treasure. This is great because the roguelite progression system will force you to run through these zones time and time again, so actually making each area a unique experience and not just giving them a different coat of paint goes a long way. Where the procedural generation for these areas comes into play is with the layout and enemy placement. Each zone essentially consists of a series of rooms, and these rooms will be mixed and matched every time you start a new run. Overall, nothing too crazy if you've played pretty much any other game with procedural generation in it. Enemies present in these rooms will of course also change with the room itself, so each run feels different from the previous one. Even if the type of enemy changes though, there's usually at max 2 enemies per room, so there is some predictability to it. I imagine this is so players don't get overwhelmed, as it might feel unfair if you're getting hit with a full gang squad in every room, but I wouldn't have minded if this did happen every now and again to add a bit more challenge. As I mentioned earlier, these zones and the baddies inhabiting them are presented with low-poly PlayStation 1 era visuals, which the developer calls out as a tribute to the golden era of gaming. I tend to agree with that statement, though it's definitely subjective. Environments and enemy models are nice and pixelated, and even the UI leans into a simplistic classic charm. I mean, just look at this spinning coin. You know the developers respect the classics when they put in spinning objects, so you know it's something that can be picked up. Seriously though, why did everything spin back then? Okay, so now let's look at combat. First though, I should call out that there's a message plastered on the start screen recommending that you play with a controller. But even if you don't have a controller, I'm here to tell you that mouse and keyboard is totally fine. So don't let that deter you from trying this game. Thankfully, you have the option to rebind your keys, which I only needed to change 2 things for a comfortable experience. Using a controller totally might be better, but I might just be a mouse and keyboard purist. I even beat Dark Souls Prepare to Die edition with a mouse and keyboard back in the day, so you know I'm serious. If you know, you know. So whether you prefer mouse and keyboard or controller, how is the combat? Well, it's Souls-like combat. Pound for pound, Souls-like combat. Light attack, heavy attack, dodge roll, parry, stamina bar, limited healing, you know the drill. I try to refrain from labeling every game with a dodge roll as Souls-like, but it's hard not to with Tyrant Realm, and the developers themselves labeled the combat as Souls-like, so there you have it. I will say, combat does feel closer to earlier Souls-likes like Dark Souls 1 due to the general slower attack speed of your character and enemies. So don't expect anything too fast-paced. For attacking, you're given a fairly impressive variety of different weapons with varying attack power, speed, and range. This includes fist weapons, rapiers, hammers, maces, scythes, and many more. Of course, because this is a roguelite, you are at the mercy of RNG as to what gear you get to use in a run based on how many you've unlocked, but we'll talk more about that and the specifics of weapons later. Defensively, you can block, parry, or dodge enemy attacks because again, we're playing a Souls-like. Tyrant Realm does seem to emphasize blocking more than the others, as you have a dedicated shield slot and will have a shield equipped at all times. You literally cannot unequip your shield and can still use it to block attacks even when holding dual-wielded weapons. Because of this is probably one of the few Souls-likes I played where I spent more time blocking than dodging. Dodging is viable as well, and I found the iframes when dodging to be fairly generous. There is this kind of awkward slow-mo effect that happens when you execute a roll just before an attack lands, however. I like that it's a way of confirming you avoided taking damage, but it often felt like it messed with my attack timing. I don't know, it's like a fight tempo kind of thing, but maybe that's just me. Parrying was something that felt weirdly difficult at first. From what I could tell, the window to land a parry is actually pretty tight. However, this isn't necessarily a bad thing, as a parry window that's too generous could lead to combat feeling too easy. This is especially important considering you're given access to an execution attack when you perform a parry and your yellow execution bar is full. This allows you to completely one-shot a stunned enemy following a successful parry. This obviously doesn't work on bosses, but does become a useful tool in clearing through regular enemies, so getting used to that parry timing is pretty important. Each weapon type also gives you a different fun little animation when performing an execution. Enemy design in Tyrant's Realm is admittedly lacking because enemies just kind of boil down to guy with weapon of varying sizes. Some are big and slow, some are small and quick, but they all swing at you with a predictable 2 or 3 hit attack string. On top of that, you'll find the enemies from previous zones repeated in the following ones, which gets to a point where the final zone is just filled with a mix of all previous enemies and nothing unique. None of the enemies really stood out because of this, which did have an effect on replayability in my opinion. Of course, one of the only non-weapon wielding enemies are these stupid dogs that are somehow always the most egregious enemies in a Soulslike. Unlike the basic enemies, I did like the game's bosses from a design perspective. Unfortunately, they also hit you with the predictable 2 or 3 hit attack strings, but there's usually a gimmick with the fight or the lead up to the fight that made things interesting. The old huntsman will have you playing a stealth game where you need to take cover from his line of sight to avoid getting shot while working your way toward the center of the arena. The Necropriest fight felt like an endurance test as he chucks magic at you and forces you to kill him not once, not twice, but 3 times to put him down for good like a true undead. My personal favorite was the disgraced chieftain who sends waves of enemies at you while watching from his throne from above. Between waves, you smash the supports below him while dodging traps to send him crashing down to your level for a one-on-one brawl. It's a pretty dynamic fight, but the real reason it's my favorite is because of Mr. Elephant Chieftain's hilariously short arms. Maybe he's disgraced because if he dropped his weapon, he'd have to get on all fours just to pick it up. Devs, if you're watching, please don't fix this. Progression-wise, you won't exactly level up your character, but you will discover these purple glowing skull altars in each zone. These will grant a percentage stat boost to your equipped gear, which are categorized by 3 colors, red, green, and yellow. These stat boosts get lower and lower the more you consecutively select the same color. So, while you could focus on wearing and boosting gear of a single color like I did, you also have the option of equipping something from all 3 colors and taking advantage of the higher percentage boosts. If this sounds familiar, that's because it's pretty much identical to the upgrade system in Dead Cells. And I like this, as the color-coded upgrade system really doesn't require a ton of thought when you're pushing through an area. When you find a skull altar, you just pick a color and carry on. It's quite seamless and doesn't completely require you to pump the brakes mid-run. As for the gear itself, you have 3 gear slots for a weapon, armor set, and shield. A lot of the weapons did feel kind of samey, with weapons of the same category often having the exact same movesets. So, for example, a pair of fist weapons has the same 1-2 light attack combo as a pair of claw weapons. And this seemed to extend to other categories as well, like rapiers and swords. I would have at least liked to see some unique effects to set each weapon apart, maybe like some sort of bleed effect on the claws. However, I did like that every weapon at least felt viable to use. I don't think I picked up a single weapon that felt like I couldn't finish a run with it equipped. Armor gets a little more interesting, as these actually do carry unique effects on them with varying levels of usefulness. The Cultist Garments carry an ability that lets you add a poison effect to your weapon that does a tiny bit of damage over time, so not super useful. The Commander's Armor comes with a ground stomp attack that does damage in a wide area around you, fairly useful when fighting more than one enemy. The Thief's Garb lets you loot coins off of dead enemies, substantially increasing coins gained during a run. Extremely useful because more money leads to unlocking more gear options among other things. There's even the Avaricious Armor, which doubles gold obtained but halves your max health, creating a sort of high-risk, high-reward challenge run while it's equipped. I'm just glad armor brings something unique to the table and leads to players actually having to consider swapping gear to take advantage of a useful ability. Oh, and shields do carry unique effects as well, but mostly in the form of passive boosts like a simple defense boost or stamina-free rolling and sprinting. So we've got our Thief's Garb on, and we've obtained a massive stockpile of gold from looting every enemy in sight. Where do we spend our hard-earned cash? This is done at the Merchant's Room, where you refill your healing flask at the end of each zone before a boss fight. You'll collect weapon, armor, and shield blueprints from slaying enemies, which, after bringing them to the merchant and spending a bit of coin, can be unlocked to appear in treasure chests. Essentially, you're investing your coins into a chance to find the item you unlocked in a future run. However, when you first purchase something, the game does let you use it right away in your current run, which is actually pretty nice. That's not all though, as you can also unlock increased healing flask charges, add randomized gear at the start of your run, and unlock shortcuts that give you the option of skipping boss fights. I invested my coins into the randomized starting gear right away, as being able to kick off a run with equipment did make trudging through the jail time and time again much easier than starting shirtless. One last thing about the Merchant's Room I did like is that there's this section featuring everything you've collected and unlocked so far in the game. It's just a nice visual touch to show off how far you've progressed and how far you have to go. I did mention the Thief's Garb is a great way to obtain coins to spend on these unlocks, but if you don't have that unlocked, you'll be finding coins the traditional way, by rolling into an ungodly amount of barrels. I probably spent just as much time rolling into barrels as I did actually fighting enemies, which, let's be honest, is pretty excessive. Enemies themselves can drop coins in addition to treasure chests, but barrels seem to be the primary way of accruing an actual cash flow. It's really not the most exciting thing ever, and I'd love to see this updated in a way that maybe emphasizes higher coin drops from enemies and bosses. And one final note on replayability before we wrap this up, Tyrant Realm definitely doesn't end after your first playthrough. After finishing the game once, you can ascend to higher difficulties for a more challenging experience. This includes spawning tougher elite enemies as well as other gimmicks like needing to find a key to be able to exit a zone. From what I could tell, these elite enemies were simply buffed up versions of regular enemies with nothing new thrown in the mix. So the replayability is there, especially if you don't mind the lack of enemy variety and want an increased challenge. In the end, Tyrant Realm's blend of roguelite progression and Soulslike combat does actually work out quite well. Despite some negatives about the game's enemy and weapon designs, I think the positives outshine them. Zones were unique and engaging, combat is largely smooth and responsive, progressing and unlocking new gear is satisfying, and boss fights are dynamic and sometimes just plain goofy. For a $10 mostly bug-free game, it doesn't exactly need to be this huge groundbreaking experience that gets everything right. And I think it gets enough right to easily justify the price. That's all for now though, so if you enjoyed this video, please consider giving it a like or sharing your thoughts on Tyrant Realm in the comments below. I appreciate every bit of interaction and support as I love making videos just like this one. So please consider subscribing to support the channel, and as always, thank you for watching.